Do you know I never know where I am, but I always end up where I'm supposed to be? Isn't that bold of me? The other day, I was sitting on a bench with my good Judy Jane Lynch in front of Carnegie Hall. We saw an angry masked ICE agent take a terrible fall. Jane crossed her legs, and I crossed mine, and then we laughed out loud until we lost our minds. It's hard to have compassion for a man who tries to ration his lack of integrity for crime. So every time you fall, we'll laugh, because we're living in a world where they fly flags half-staff for political peasants and deplorable riffraff. And then I vomited. Do you know I never know where I am, but I always end up where I'm supposed to be? Isn't that lyrical of me? The other day, I was swimming in the Dead Sea with my good Judy, and it dawned on me that Judy's never mentioned in the papers. Judy's never noted on the news. But loving her is easier than a Christofferson tune. Weirdness follows me wherever I go. Weirdness seems to know me better than I seem to know myself. I'm someone else, looking to the clock beside my bed. Am I really keeping time, or is it only keeping me instead? Should I just go back to bed? Or wake and bake to face all the hippodromes and hedons sipping Seagrams from my mug, pills at all the after parties that we sweep beneath the rug, figuring that loving's just the kind of dice that you throw. And I wonder, can a cactus and a lily find a common pot to grow? I don't see spaces in between. I don't see colors running down the TV screen. There's no lines written in this scene, so I won't say a thing until I look up and see Judy drowning. And then I vomited. Do you know I never know where I am, but I always end up where I'm supposed to be? Isn't that appetizing? The other day, I was in the library with my good Judy Mary, J. Blige, and I stumbled across a book about getting out of your way and saying what you really want to say without your inner saboteur getting in the way. It was in the self-help section, nestled between sports and leisure and eroticism. But what I loved most was the recipe for artisan toast that someone wrote on a Post-it note, covering the New York Times pull quote and the author's personalized anecdotes. But as I started to read this very long essay, I could tell that the author wasn't really saying what he wanted to say. And I thought, is this his way of projecting his inner saboteur onto us in the form of wordplay for a payday? Because it was obvious to me that the author really didn't know what he wanted to say. Well, at that moment, Mary walked up, and I put the book away. But I took that Post-it note, and I slipped it into my coat, and I went home and I made that artisan toast. But it was gross, and so I vomited. Do you know I never know where I am, but I always end up where I'm supposed to be? Isn't that ironic? The other day, I was having brunch with Alanis Morissette at a vegetarian restaurant that didn't serve alcohol, so I brought my own. And after waiting in the lobby for 37 minutes only to realize it was self-seating, I realized that Alanis was already there. As I walked up to the table and I wiped the leaves and branches out of the green Tupperware chair, Alanis looked up at me and immediately said, "Kelly, how about getting off of these antibiotics?" And I said, "Oh, Alanis, it doesn't matter. Nothing really matters anymore, anyway." And as I sat down in the green Tupperware chair and nestled my kitten heels into the dirt and wiped the dried up syrup off the menu, Alanis looked at me and she said, "Kelly, actually, nothing really matters." And I said, "Oh, when you put it like that, it has a whole new meaning." And she said, "Exactly. Isn't it ironic?" And I said, "Don't you think?" And she said, "A little too ironic." And I said, "Yeah, I really do think." And then we leaned in to kiss, cheek to cheek. And as our cheeks were parting, a little piece of Brussels sprouts got caught on our chin. And Alanis laughed. and I vomited. You know, I never know where I am, but I always end up where I'm supposed to be. Isn't that sensational? My favorite days in LA are nights, on our way to the lesbian cafes with open mics, bright lights in the big city, looking young and feeling pretty. We call ourselves the Itty Bitty Titty Committee, with our guitars in hands ready to fight, because every tool is a weapon if you hold it right. With our shaved heads and our torn up denim, smoking cigarettes and sinning, with sweaty palms waiting our turn to take to the stage and wondering, will they ever learn? The buildings and bridges are made to bend in the wind. To withstand the world, that's what it takes. All that steel and stone is no match for the air, my friend. Do you know I never know where I am, but I always end up where I'm supposed to be? Isn't that suspicious? The other day, I was sitting in the morning at the diner on the corner, waiting at the counter for the man to pour the coffee. And he fills it only halfway, and before I can even argue, he's looking out the window at somebody coming in. It's the valet from Meridian Way, and he offers me a set of keys and says, "Would you like a free Harley?" And I said, "Who? Me?" Well, I revved up the engine, and it started to roar, and I was ready to ride that bitch like a midnight whore. And he said, "Have you ever driven one of these before?" And I said, "Only in my dreams." As real as it may seem, it was only in my dreams. And I put the pedal to the metal, and I took off, only to find myself at that diner where I was before, eating beef stroganoff. And I looked out the window, and there was a woman on the outside looking inside. Does she see me? No, she does not really see me, because she sees her own reflection. And I try not to notice as she's hitching up her skirt to straddle that Harley. And I thought, am I her? Is she me? Is any of this real? Or is it just a blur? And then I finished my coffee, and I vomited. Do you know I never know where I am, but I always end up where I'm supposed to be? The other day I was at a fashion show in DTLA for an up-and-coming fashion designer whose name was a Roman numeral. I was seated next to Michelle Pfeiffer and Timothée Chalamet, and the models were stomping down the runway as if it was their last day on Earth. And just as the show was coming to a nail-biting conclusion, a woman from the audience stood up and said, "I pledge of allegiance to the Prada bag, one nation under Gucci, red-bottom Louboutin, and the home of Gautier. We need fashion on the front lines. No more basic camo. We need camo couture. We need Linda Evangelista wearing Amelia Earhart and Stephen Meisel capturing it for Italian Vogue magazine. The editorial will be called Bringing the Front Lines to the Met Gala. And Anna Wintour will be our commander-in-chief, because you better believe any woman who wears her sunglasses at night is always ready to put up a fight." And at that moment, the security came and dragged me away, but not before I could blow a kiss to Timothée Chalamet. He laughed, and I vomited. Do you know I never know where I am, but I always end up where I'm supposed to be? Isn't that interesting? Does your mind ever worry when you wonder what you wonder why it might worry your mind more? Does your mind care that it scares you, tears you up inside when it isn't there, but you need to be aware to take the dare to take the ride? Or do you just hide in the corner? Does your mind ever aggravate your soul when you try to navigate below the degree of where they are and the degree of who you were meant to be? Do you turn verbs into prepositions or partake in propositions that will put you in the place where you're supposed to be? It takes a lot of work to jerk off the man and still try to understand the home of the brave and the land of the free. but I'm very good at multitasking and taking what's mine without asking. And I still have time to flip on you like a dime and still be home by 3. So don't try it, little girl. Look in the mirror and get real, and let go of the chains that they have on your brains and set yourself free. I said all of this in Jane Fonda's flat while looking at a mirror of me, but the mirror wasn't looking back. And then I vomited. Do you know I never know where I am, but I always end up where I'm supposed to be? Isn't that suspicious of me? The other day, I was with my good Judy, Natasha Leone, and we were at the AutoZone getting oil changes. And we walked across the street to the cafe to partake in a parfait. And I said, you know, the butter melts out of habit. The toast isn't even warm. And the waitress and the man in the plaid shirt play out a scene they've played so many times before. And the coffee is just water dressed in brown. And Natasha looked at me and said, shh, don't make a sound. And then I vomited. The other day, I was in the theater district of New York with my good Judy Bjork, and we stumbled across an old theater where I had once done a play called The Left Fork. As a sign of the times, they were tearing it down. You know, they're renaming the Kennedy Center after the Orange Clown. And I walked in and I looked around, and there was a chill in the air. It was the kind of chills that give you thrills to dream and double dare. And I walked right in and went backstage, and there was no one there. So I took it in and I touched the skin of who I was back then. And I saw who I was today. And I walked out onto the stage. It was dark as night. And I stood there and I smelled the air that put me on this flight. I saw my ghost and Beckett's too. And I knew exactly what to do. You can try to take away our stages, but you will never take away our light. And then I vomited. Do you know I never know where I am, but I always end up where I'm supposed to be? Isn't that sublime? The other night, I was with my good Judy's Katie Lang and Shania Twain. We were feasting on midnight snacks, which consisted of bagel bites and Apple Jacks. And we were visited by the ghost of Jack Kerouac. He came to us in the form of salt and pepper shakers. And we talked about risk takers and magic makers and groundbreaking beat makers. And drums kept pounding rhythm to the brain, and the beat goes on. And then Brandy Carlisle showed up and serenaded us with a song. And out of nowhere I screamed, from Castro Street to Broadway, from the Great Lakes to the Miami runways, queer culture reigns supreme. So don't forget to dream. And I looked down at my bagels smothered in sour cream, and I vomited. Do you know I never know where I am, but I always end up where I'm supposed to be? Isn't that stimulating? The other day, I was having fun in the sun with my good Judy Martha Plimpton. Our reflections were reflected in the mirrored walls of the nearby Cinnabon, and we reflected on moments with mirrors that we assumed were reflected on by everyone. You know those moments when you're at a packed party, and you excuse yourself to go potty, but what you're really searching for is a well-lit bathroom with a locked door so that you can talk to yourself in the mirror. Have you ever done that before? And you say into the mirror, there's too many shadows, whispering voices, faces on posters, too many choices. If, when, why, what? How much have you got? And then you hear a knock at the door. Hey, how much longer are you going to be in there for? So you flush the toilet to make it seem real, and you wash your hands to keep up the appeal. And then you open the door only to find that there's no one there. It was all in your mind, just like it was behind the closed door. And then I vomited.